In this video, I hope to talk about the balance of power, which is so central to international relations, and how the shifting balance of power at the end of the 19th century brought about the demise of the Ottoman Empire, in particular, the growth of German power. For much of the 19th century, Britain was the protector of the Ottoman Empire. It was the protector of the Ottoman Empire for a simple reason, which was that the Russians had grown to be the great, in a sense, competitors with the British. And they had pushed down, beginning with Ivan the Terrible in the 15th century. Russian Empire had grown north of the Ottomans and pushed back the Ottomans. Catherine the Great had taken Crimea, at the north of the Black Sea. The Russian Navy in the Black Sea was eager to break through the Dardanelles and the Bosphorus Straits, which kept control of the way out of the Black Sea into the Mediterranean and the Aegean Sea. So the Ottomans, in a sense, had the Russians corked up in the Black Sea. The Russians wanted Istanbul. They wanted free passage. They wanted to be a world naval power. The only other way out for the Russian Navy was, of course, in the north, through the Baltic. And Peter the Great had spent his time building port city of St. Petersburg to try to allow the Russian Navy out. But for 6 months out of the year, the Baltic is frozen. So Russia was looking for a warm water port and a way out. Britain, the major competitor with Russia, wanted to keep the Russian Navy corked up in the Black Sea. And that meant keeping the Ottoman Empire alive. Now, in the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was already in decline. As Europe grew, Britain became the major power of the world, the workshop of the world in the 1650s. Most of world industrial goods were built in Britain. So the money, the capital, meant the growth of European powers. Not only France, but Great Britain and the United States was emerging. This meant that old empires, like the Ottoman Empire, even though they were not declining in terms of their national income, their population, they were in relative decline because European powers were moving forward at such an incredible clip. As we talked about earlier, the National Revolution gave them an edge, but also the Industrial Revolution, which was going on at the same time. So the Ottomans became weaker and weaker. The world powers, France, Russia, Austro-Hungarian Empire, Britain, had been picking off Ottoman lands one after the next. The French took Algeria in 1830. The British took Egypt, 1882. Cyprus was before that. Much of North Africa then fell at the end of the century to the French, to the Italians in Libya. But the Russians were pushing down on the north, working their way around the Black Sea and hitting Anatolia from the east. The Austro-Hungarians were helping the Baltic states break free. Greece in the 1820s and 30s broke free. So the Ottoman Empire had been shrinking rapidly during the 19th century. It might have fallen had not Britain began to side with it against the Russians. This phenomenon of Britain coming to the rescue of the Ottoman heartlands was seen most vividly in the Crimean War, 1854, when the Russians tried to push the Ottomans completely out of the Black Sea. Britain came to their rescue, and many thousands of British soldiers were killed during the Crimean War in an effort to keep the Ottomans alive, keep them in control of Istanbul and the Bosphorus Straits. What changes this major competition between Russia on the one hand and Britain on the other? Not only competition over the Ottoman Empire, but over Iran, Afghanistan, and right across Asia. What's often been called the Great Game. That is the competition between Russia as it pushed out eastward and Great Britain as it tried to consolidate its grip over its great sprawling empire. Today, the Great Game is still being played out. Of course, it was called the Cold War during most of this past century, and the United States took over the job of Britain, really, as sort of the Western champion, and fought with the Soviet Union over places like Afghanistan, for power in the Middle East, Egypt, so forth. That great game was playing out happily, if you will, in the 19th century, and the Ottomans could exploit it because the British didn't want them to collapse. What happened leading up to the First World War that caused Britain to invade the Ottoman Empire, occupy it, and divide it up into nation states? The rise of Germany is the short answer to that. Central Europe had been really in chaos for much of the early modern period. The German region was 300 statelets, principalities, bishoprics, free cities, until Napoleon invaded it in the beginning of the 19th century. Then it became 33 states, and it wasn't until the rise of Bismarck in the 1860s that Germany begins to unify. And in a series of 3 short wars, Bismarck unifies the German Empire around Prussia, the Prussian state, and turns it into one big empire by 1871. In the last of these wars, Germany invades France in 1870. And in a blitzkrieg, it manages to go to Paris and humiliate the French, forcing them to sign a treaty. From that moment on, the French are determined that they have to make alliances in order to keep the Germans contained. The French look to the Russians, who are on the other side of Germany, and also to the British, and struggle to form what later becomes the Entente Cordiale in the First World War. The Russians, the British, the French, which become the heart of a new alliance designed to contain Germany. Germany, to break out of this, allies itself with the Austro-Hungarian Empire and ultimately the Ottoman Empire. And those are what are called the Central Powers in World War I. Now, how does this affect the Ottomans? It affects the Ottomans because for the Russians and the British to actually ally, they have to compose their differences. And to buy Russian favor, the British increasingly decide that the Ottoman Empire can be expended and that the Russians will be able to own Istanbul. When the Russians begin to fall out of World War I and collapse with the Russian Revolution, 1917, we later discovered that Britain, in an attempt to keep the Russians fighting on the Eastern Front, had offered Istanbul and the Straits as, in a sense, war booty to keep the Russians in the war. This is what ultimately undermined the stability of the Ottoman Empire, the British support for the Ottoman Empire, the growth of Bismarck and later a unified Germany that became aggressive, forced the Russians and the British to compose their differences, and the Ottoman Empire was sacrificed on the altar of this new alliance. So the balance of power had shifted inalterably with the rise of Germany, and this undermined the Ottoman Empire.